Pastor Hasani and his lovely wife, Danielle, and they can take us through.
Tessie.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, it is such a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. South Africa is the most beautiful thing. I feel so connected in so many ways. It's almost like I'm home, and I am. Y'all are my people, and we are your people. And I just thank you guys for being so inviting. Is it okay that we be ourselves this morning? Is that going to be okay with y'all? Can we tell some truths?
Is that all right?
Is that okay?
Can we just keep it real today?
Because we're going to be honest with you and share with you the path that led us to today. Even though you're looking at us today and you say, they're the founders of Couples Academy, and look what they've done, and we go and we deal with couples all around the world. There was a time when it wasn't always glitz and glam, right? There was a way back when. And we want to share with you some of the struggles that we went through so that we can get to the next thing.
And so before we get into all that goodness, first of all, we have to acknowledge the founder, the pastor, the visionary of Faith Hill Church, Pastor Tafara, who's not with us, but this is an extraordinary man, a leader. He is a dear friend. You know, it was T.E. Lawrence who said, all men dream, but not equally. Those men who dream at night in the dusty recesses of their minds awaken to find that it was but vanity. But those who dream by day, these are the dangerous ones, for they dream with their eyes open to make sure that their dreams come true. And Pastor Tafara is one of those dangerous men who has dreamt with his eyes open. And just a few years later, we're now starting to see the manifestation of that dream. So for all that he has done in being a visionary leader and being a spiritual leader over everyone in this house, let's just give him a strong round of applause for him and his beautiful wife, who do an extraordinary job. And so we're just happy to be here. Me for the second time, my wife for the first time, and it truly feels like home here.
It does feel like home.
And so we're going to dig in deep. We're going to share with you who we are and what we've gone through, because unfortunately, there's so many people who may come before you who present themselves as faultless, as sinless, as if they've been through nothing in their relationship, and it's kind of hard to connect with them. And so you need to know that even though we're doing well today, it wasn't always like that. And so to Danielle's point, we went through some trials and tribulations, and we want to kind of share some of those things with you and then give you some principles that will anchor you in your marriage so that you can take your relationship to the next level. How many, by show of hands, want a better relationship? Yes. Okay. If you want something more, if you want something better, you came to the right place. So before we get started, listen, you have a piece of paper. I encourage, I implore, I significantly want to encourage you to write down a question. Regardless of what we're here talking about, you came here this morning with an issue, with a problem, with a concern, with something that you need to have addressed. And we don't want you leaving here without getting the answer to that question or the solution to that problem. So much so that I will even cut this presentation short so we can spend more time on the Q&A side so that you get what it is that you came for. So let's just give you foundation. So Couples Academy, we've been around for quite some time, and we created this organization to help couples by placing them on the path to fulfillment, or those who are in crisis, on the verge of divorce, just discovered an infidelity, and they are on the road to recovery. But that's why we did it. But we did it because of the pain that we've experienced in our relationship. And I would say 3 years into I Do, we were on the verge of divorce. And so either she was going to divorce me, I was going to divorce her. But it was at that moment that we made the decision, or I made the decision first, to divorce me from myself. To divorce myself from my false sense of masculinity that didn't work in favor of our marriage. To divorce myself from my poor communication skills, because I remember I was very critical, I was very judgmental, I would shut her down, I wouldn't honor her opinion, I would expose her, and the worst part about it, I did it unconsciously, because I was raised in a very critical, judgmental home, and it became a part of who I am. It became a part of my family marinade. And so when I became an adult and entered into an adult relationship, I brought that into the relationship with me. And I didn't realize how critical and how critical our relationship was based upon my own insecurities, my own faults, fears, inadequacies, and it literally almost ripped our marriage apart. And I remember in an argument one day, we're sitting on the edge of the bed. Danielle's in tears. She's crying. She looks me in the eye, and she says, "What?"
You declitterize me. You know, my issues started when I was growing up in my home. I came from a broken home. So my parents divorced. There was a lot of violence in my home. There was fighting in my home. I had witnessed my own father pull a gun out and say, give it to my brother and say, kill yourself. Just go ahead, kill yourself. So I didn't come from a home that was, you know, peaceful and that had balance and that made sense. It was crazy. And so coming from that, there was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of issues that I brought into the relationship. But then growing up and after the divorce and having 3 brothers who I think they tried to overcompensate for the lack in the home, I never heard a criticism from them. I never heard a fault or a flaw from them. To them, I was the apple of the eye. I was their sister, and I meant everything to them. So when I married this one, and he was Romeo when we first got to, when I tell you Romeo, I mean like yelling up to the window like, Danielle, Danielle, wherefore out there? You know, and I would be like, oh, Lord, that is a bit much, you know? But that's who he was. But then when we got together and I started to see the layers of the onion unpeel, I'm like, oh, that's not who I thought I married. He's judgmental. He's critical. And I've never heard all of this about me. I mean, of course, I'm perfect because nobody ever said anything.
So she thought.
So I thought. Now, did I really think I was perfect? No. But I didn't have a concept to receive all the criticism. So you can see that a lot of the issues we have in our marriage stem from stuff that we picked up along the way that we didn't even realize. We didn't ask to grow up in the homes that we grew up in. He came from a critical home. He didn't ask for that, but we are marinated in it, and when we're unconscious of it, then we bring it into our relationship.
And so because of these challenges, I mean, that coupled with the fact that, you know, when you're married, we had children very young. We were broke, busted, and disgusted, didn't have a pot to pee in or a window to throw it out of. We had all types of challenges. There were times when the lights were out, rent was late. So we're fighting about money. We're fighting because of our communication issues. It got to a point where we didn't even like each other anymore. There was no passion. There was no sex. We were just 2 strangers living in the same household who shared nothing but a couple of bills and a whole bunch of kids. And so those children oftentimes became the source of our affection, the source of our attention. We took off our husband and wife hat and put on our mommy and daddy hat. And the love that we used to give each other, we now gave to the children. The resources that we used to invest in each other, we now invested in the children. And that became the focus of our relationship. And so we went through what we call the 3 stages that many couples go through. We went from being soulmates to rollmates to roommates. There was an emotional disconnect. And based upon that disconnect, what happens is when you have a desire to connect, you will connect with anything and wherever you can get it from. And then that's when inappropriate interactions and conversations started to come into our relationship.
Absolutely. And, you know, Hasani has been speaking at college campuses and universities and organizations since we met. And so he always traveled abroad and all over. And so, but I never had a reason to not trust him until our relationship started to fade and we became distant. Not only did he have opportunities left and right to engage, and you could talk about that, to engage or to deal with other women. He had many opportunities. But I also had friends and connections right on the ground where I was. And so I remember there was a time where a long-lost friend, now you know about these long-lost friends. It's easier than ever to connect with a long-lost friend, social media, right? Well, I remember a long-lost friend had found me on Facebook back when Facebook was just like really getting started. And I was so happy because we were so disconnected. And I wasn't interested in a sexual relationship. These things start out innocent, don't they? Like you never plan to do these things. They're very innocent. You're just excited because, oh, I haven't seen you in so long, and all the feelings and emotions come back because your brain is a recorder of emotions and feelings and experiences. And so it's almost like euphoria when you reconnect with someone. And so I was so happy to have him in my life and to communicate with him. And I remember sharing it with you, saying, you know, my friend Squirrel, like, I just want you to meet him. And it started out innocently, but it could have quickly turned into something. And so that was an emotional connection. It had not moved into an emotional affair, but it was the road to an emotional affair until we checked it.
And I think it's important for us to understand, you know, since we're on this topic of affairs, what affairs actually are. Because many of us take a very one-dimensional approach to an affair. So we equate it with something that is strictly physical, that unless there was sex involved, then whatever we're doing is appropriate. But it's not appropriate, because you can have an affair of the heart, right? An emotional affair doesn't necessarily have to involve your body, though it can. I say this all the time. The affairs never begin in the bedroom. They end in the bedroom. And slowly but surely, over the course of time, if you have boundaries that become a little bit blurred, you can easily cross over into things that you should not be in. And so, as a result, infidelity can occur. And so that's why it's important as couples that we truly embrace intimacy, right? Intimacy. Into me see. Allowing your partners to see inside your heart, to see inside your soul. Intimacy is not just physical. In essence, there are, 4 aspects of who we are. You have your spiritual self. You have your emotional self. You have your intellectual self, and then your physical self. And so it is important, if you're truly entering into oneness or intimacy, that you're connected in all 4 areas. Because if we're connected physically, because that's what marriage allows you to do, but we're not connected emotionally, there's a problem. If we can have great conversation and intellectualize and talk about politics and talk about Trump and talk about a movie we just saw and talk about what we're doing for the weekend and talking about everybody else's relationship but our own, if we can connect intellectually but not spiritually, then there's a void, there's a breach, there's a break. And so you want to do the best you can to connect in all 4 areas, truly become one, because once you're connected, then there's no need or desire to connect with anyone outside. But when there is no connection, what happens is you begin to build a wall between you and your spouse, a wall that prevents her from getting in and from me getting into her emotionally. And so as walls are developed, windows are then constructed, and now we're able to look and connect with people outside the marriage. So if you really want to preserve your marriage, you got to build walls around your marriage and build windows in between you and your spouse so that you can connect into one another. And I think that's where the challenge is. Many of us are in marriage, but we don't realize that there are rules, that there are laws, that there are principles by which you should govern your relationship. And if you have no laws that govern your relationship, in essence, you're lawless. If you're lawless, then that means that there's the potential for anarchy. And if there's a potential for anarchy, then that means anything can happen. That's when destruction begins to take place in a relationship. So just as she was connected to someone, a friend, nothing happened. I also traveling around the country, speaking on college campuses. Now I'm young at the time. We're married, 25, 26, so we're still young. You know, so I'm building relationships and connections and having conversations online that were, I wouldn't say inappropriate because there was nothing sexual, but the point is I was connecting in a way with someone else the way I should have been connecting with my wife. And see, that's how it happens. And if we view affairs or inappropriate relationships as the worst that it can be, sex, and don't look at all of the steps that lead up to that, then we're doing ourselves a great injustice. Does that make sense?
And just to speak to the walls that are built up, and these walls are built up by both genders. It's not a woman's thing versus a man's thing. But I just remember having these walls, and the whole criticism piece was a big part of our issue. And I remember that it got to the point where my walls were so fortified that it didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter if he spoke a compliment. It didn't matter if he spoke a criticism. None of it would penetrate. I was so protected all around. But as a Christian wife, I felt that it was my responsibility still to do certain things. So you would never know. If you saw us, you would never know that there was anything going on because I would still cook, I would still do the duties. But inside, internally, there was a disconnect. And I remember having to go into the shower and pray and just really ask God to help me anytime and every time we needed to be intimate. It was a struggle because we were so disconnected here. And for me, there was such a need for the emotional connection to him because for me, intimacy without, or sex without intimacy feels like rape. And that's how it feels to many women. When there's no intimacy and you're just doing things and going through the motion, you're feeling empty, and that hole gets bigger and bigger. So it was important, and Hasani began to see this when I made that statement that you declitterized me, because I no longer felt like a woman. I no longer felt that feminine connection, that there was something that he needed to do. And it wasn't that I hadn't been saying it and speaking it, and others hadn't been saying it and speaking it, but it was the Lord, really, that made the change. And share how that happened.
We're going to get there in a second, but she said something very important, and I want all the men to pay attention, that for her, sex was emotional, not just physical. And men and women are wired differently. For men, like, we don't need to necessarily be, connected emotionally to have the desire and to engage in sex with our spouse. But women need that, typically speaking. So what we find is that men want their wives to be the best lover inside the bedroom, but wives want their husbands to be the best lover outside the bedroom. So oftentimes her sexual needs aren't sexual at all. They're emotional. And so romance is a big part of it. Foreplay is a big part of it. But foreplay is not just physically touching and stimulating your spouse. Foreplay starts at the beginning of the day. It starts when you first wake up. It starts with how you communicate, how you embrace your partner, what you do to accommodate them, how you serve their needs. And so I'm going to give you let's do a quick demonstration to really allow it to sink in. So this is a marriage seminar, all right, so you could be free. I want
Please be free.
Every man who's sitting next to their wife, okay, if your wife is here, I want you to take your hand and place it on the inner part of her thigh.
We married. It's okay. It's all right. It's okay.
You're getting nervous already. I see it.
It's okay.
All right? Now, what happens is if your hand is there long enough, that sensation will begin to travel. But it travels past her sexual organs all the way up to her emotional headquarters. And so now she's thinking, well, how did you treat me? And how did you talk to me?
It bypasses the heart, y'all. Did you hear what he said? Because we're not dealing with love, okay? He said it bypasses everything and goes right up here, past the heart. Now go ahead.
Right, so you're processing, how did you treat me, and how were the last few days, and how do I feel emotionally, and all of those different things. And if you did the right thing, if you treated me, if you loved me, then that feeling goes right back to those sexual organs. They become stimulated, and she's ready to go. And so oftentimes we could wind up doing all the wrong things in the relationship, but still want to get that sex. And so for a lot of women, it's a turnoff. And so the way that you stimulate her and turn her on is not just physical, but it is mental, it is emotional as well. They need that connection. Now, wives, take your hands and put it on the inner thigh of your husband.
It's okay. It's all right. We are married.
All right? If you keep it there for 30 more seconds, we're going to have to cut this seminar short. Is that right? Because we don't require. And so it's important to understand how your spouse is wired, right? We always want them to accommodate our needs and do what we want them to do for us, not realizing that love is a giving expression, not a receiving expression. Now, when you operate according to laws, things work. So I'll give you one law. There's something called the law of reciprocal altruism, okay? The law of reciprocal altruism. Sounds like a bit work. But to reciprocate means I do for you, you do for me. Altruism, or to be altruistic, means to do good things, all right? So according to this law, you have organism A, organism B. Organism A will contribute to the life and vitality of organism B, even if it means the loss of its own life and vitality. But it does it with the understanding that organism B will also contribute to the life and vitality of organism A, even if it means the loss of its own. Now, in this system, if both are giving but losing in the process, no one ever loses because they're both operating according to the same system. So they both win. So for me to get from my wife what I desire, I first have to focus on giving and pouring into her, because in our marriage, which is very principle-based and law-based, and we have government that keeps parameters in place so that we're operating according to something where we both win. As long as I give, I don't have to worry about what I quote-unquote am losing, because I never lose, because she's always giving to me. And when we both do that, we both win. The problem is most of us are waiting for the person to do something first. Well, when you do something, then I'm going to do something. Well, if you act right, then I'm going to act right. And it's very tit for tat, and we go back and forth, and that's how we get into all of these power struggles rather than coming together based upon principle and becoming power couples. And so just basic tweaks and adjustments in your marriage can shift the trajectory that your marriage is on. Does that make sense? It's quiet in here, but hopefully somebody's getting something.
That means they're listening.
But I was supposed to comment on something.
I wanted you to bring it full circle. How you got to where you? How did we get to where we are? Because you told them that you were critical and judgmental, and nobody can believe that.
So it came to the point where Danielle was just like, you know what? I'm done. I'm good. You do you, because I'm going to do me. Now, once she said that, I'm like, oh, snap. I'm in trouble now. So even if she stayed in the marriage, I knew what path we were going down, because it was over. There was nothing between us. And it was that statement that helped me realize if I don't do something now, even if she stays, I'm going to lose her forever. How many know there are people who are legally married, but then there are people who are still in their marriage that are emotionally and socially, let me repeat. There are people who are legally married, and then those who are legally divorced, right? So people get divorces all the time. But how do we know you could be divorced in your marriage? You can experience an emotional or social divorce, yet still married. And so we have these public weddings, these private marriages, but these secret separations. And so to the outside world, it appears that everything's all well, but secretly, we're living two separate lives. That's where we were on the verge of. And so it was at that moment that I said, I got to do whatever it takes to save this marriage. Because ladies, let me tell you something. Men and women are motivated by two different things. Women generally are motivated by the hope of a future gain. Right? So I'm motivated by the hope of what things can possibly be. And I'm looking at his potential, and I'm praying, and I'm talking to my other sisters, and I'm staying in there because I believe things can turn around. That's what motivates women. Generally speaking, men are motivated by the fear of loss. So if I fear that I may lose my wife and lose my marriage, I'm now then motivated to do something to save it. Now, that motivation to save my marriage causes me to then focus on my relationship. Now, marriage, relationship, two separate things. Your relationship speaks to your companionship. That's your emotional connection. That's the sexual fulfillment. Speaking each other's love language, meeting each other's emotional needs. That's the heartfelt connection. Companionship, relationship. Marriage is more of the institution, right? It's the delegation of responsibilities. It's the management of the home. It's how we raise our children. It's our finances. It's all the benefits, if you will, if the marriage is in place, that you receive from the relationship. A lot of women want the relationship within the marriage. A lot of men want the marriage regardless of whether the relationship is good or not. And so I was motivated to save my marriage, which means I had to reconnect and establish rapport in my relationship. So I started reading books. We got a system that walked us through our own personal intensive, where we did deep dive research and counseling and coaching, and we had this entire program that guided us through a process. And so what we realized is that even though we needed to work on our marriage, really the key of it all was working on ourselves. That as long as I was trying to fix the marriage, what I was really trying to do was fix her, because I made her responsible in my mind for everything that was wrong with the marriage. But when I decided to look internally, and I began to realize that I am the lowest common denominator in every relationship I enter into, and I began to work on me and change things within me, I made an internal vow within my mind, within my heart, never to criticize Danielle again. Now, I did in my mind, but I would not form my lips to even utter a criticism. That began the process of my personal recovery, because if I went from always criticizing her to never verbally doing it, to then slowly but surely changing my perspective and looking at her through different lenses, not those critical lenses, but I began to look at her the way God would look at her. And I had a different mindset, but that was based upon my own individual transformation that I had to go through. And when I became the best version of myself, the marriage naturally benefited.
Yes, and look, I mean, that's worthy of a little bit of applause. And the reason why I say that is because we think that we can't change, and we say this all the time, he'll never change, she'll never change. But change is possible. And I remember that season and thinking, whatever. You know, he would come and sit next to me and he would say, let's watch these videos. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna watch it, but I'm not listening. And you kept doing it. He kept coming with new content and changing. And I began to believe in him again because I had lost belief. You know, when you get married, a lot of times women, what Hasani said is so true. We start to see the seed before the seed is even developed, right? It's like there's some potential in this man, and I feel that I'm assigned to help develop that potential, so I'm gonna stick it out. But after a while, when things start going awry, you begin to lose faith. And I had lost faith. But when he kept coming, and he was relentless, and he wouldn't give up on me, and he wouldn't give up on the marriage, slowly but surely, I began to believe again. And when I believed again, then I got on board, and that's when we started to see a huge transformation in our marriage.
And so this is an excellent lesson. So a lot of times when people come to us for counseling or intensives or whatever the case may be, they're not both on the same page. They don't both want the same thing. Usually someone is tuned out, they're done, they're like, whatever, and then the other person is really motivated. And I want to encourage you that if you're in that situation now, all it takes is one person to initiate the process. And if you're consistent enough, and if you don't give up, cave in, and quit and throw in the towel, eventually you'll begin to see a change and a shift in your relationship. Don't be weary in well-doing, for what? In due season you shall reap if, here's the condition, if you faint not. And so the question is, how bad do you really want what you say that you want? What are you willing to do to get what it is that you say that you want? If you're willing to put in the time and put in the effort, if you're willing to sacrifice, if you're willing, here's the deal. Here's the deal. I shared this with the singles last night in a different context, but I'm going to share it with you. How many of you, by a show of hands, truly want your marriage? But you want a successful marriage, right? A mutually beneficial, long-lasting marriage. Okay, so here's the principle. Whatever you say yes to, you have to protect it by surrounding it with a whole bunch of no's. I'll say that again. If you're saying yes to your marriage, then you have to protect it by saying no. When you want to say yes to your marriage, protect it by saying no to a whole lot of things that may distract or get in the way of the union that you're trying to establish. And I think that oftentimes when we come into relationships, we bring a lot of stuff with us, not just baggage, but sometimes we bring, whatever it may be, whatever is a distraction and gets in the way of this becomes a problem. Because this right here is the primary relationship. Everything else is secondary to this. Because at the end of the day, I got to come home to this. I got to sleep with this. I got to raise children here. I have a future here. So I'm not going to compromise the integrity of this relationship because I'm allowing other things that I've said yes to get in the way of this. Now, with balance, we understand that even though we're one, right, there's still levels of freedom in our relationship. I mean, I still have a life outside of my marriage with my wife. I still have dear friends outside of the relationship that I have with my wife. And the hell is this is over. And so one of the things that we do, we have something called the hub and spoke support model. So if you think about a wheel on a car, you've got the hub in the middle and the spokes that come outside of that hub. Well, if you place you and your spouse inside the hub, what are the spokes of support that surround your marriage that contribute to it as opposed to take away from it? So I'll just give you one example. It's important to have individuals in your life that support you and support your relationship. In essence, friends of the marriage. If I have individuals in my life who are not living a life that is suitable for me to be associated with because maybe they lack integrity, they're not doing the right thing, or they had to have a completely different lifestyle, being around them long enough, it can start to impact me individually and then the marriage. But surrounding yourself with other couples who have a desire for great relationship and who exhibit it on a natural basis, on a normal basis, that's who you want to be around. So here we are. I've been in Africa now for 2 weeks. First week in Nigeria, had a blast. And so this week we're here in South Africa to be with you, but we're also celebrating, our anniversary that's coming up. My wife's birthday is coming up. And so whoever we connect with, we want to make sure that they are people who will positively feed into us and keep us on the right track. So relationships are critical. So we came with a couple today, John and Portia Scott. They are very dear friends of us. Now, they have an amazing relationship. And so we glean and learn from one another. There are things that they may possibly, learn from us occasionally, but there are things that we definitely learn from them. And so they support this. And so because we said yes to this, we easily could say yes to that because it reinforces this yes. Does that make sense? So your relationships are so critically important, and other things you do to keep you anchored in your marriage.
Absolutely, and we have to be mindful that we rid ourselves of those relationships that are counterproductive to this model, because a lot of us have our girlfriends and our corner that supports us in the actions that we do that aren't necessarily positive for our marriage. We all have those girlfriends that we tell all our business to when things aren't going right with our husband, and then we regret it after the fact when we're on the mend. How many times have you said something that you should not have said, and then that person can't get over it because they don't have the heart connection that you do? So when you go tell your mama and your daddy what your husband did or what your wife did, when you guys go to Couples Academy to get healed and everything is right, they're still mad. So we just have to be very careful about who we tell, what we tell, and make sure that we have a very strong network of community around us that can support our marriage.
Is this making sense? Is this helping out? Because these are the challenges that we go through. And if we have, and see, this is where, and we're kind of tiptoeing through a few different things because we want the real meat to come out in the Q&A. But I'm going to tell you something. If there's any principle, if there's any law that you should have to govern your relationship, it is the power or the law of agreement. The Bible says, can two walk together unless they be in agreement? And I know a lot of couples who operate on, we just going to agree to disagree. And that becomes the DNA of their relationship. And so you have two individuals who just disagree on everything. And so because they disagree on everything, it creates tension, stress, and challenges in the relationship that separate them. And so it's important to make sure that you are like-minded. When we talk about couples, right, who are not married yet, when they go through the seasons of a successful relationship, the dating season, committed courtship, engagement, and marriage, that committed courtship season is the time that you take to really get to know the person to see if you have the right foundation. But you never stop learning about your partner, because when you say I do, you're going to have to learn your partner all over again because you're in a new season of life. And so if Danielle at 20, what were you, 23 when I met you? 23, 24? Something like that. Danielle at 23 is different than Danielle at 41. She's a different person. And so therefore, I have to learn her all over again. I have to see who she is today versus then. And if I hold on to 23-year-old Danielle as a 41-year-old woman, we're going to have problems and complications. And so it's important to grow with your partner. It's important to learn along the way with your partner. A principle that we believe in is this: become a student of your spouse. So I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey. I got my degree, right? I've always been, after getting my degree, someone who had a thirst and a passion for knowledge. And so I can speak intelligently on a number of different topics. But how many of us are experts at things in the world, but we're completely ignorant when it comes to our spouse? Because we've been living our life by remote control, not paying attention, not investing the time, not taking the time to really understand who our spouse is. And so as a result of that, we're disconnected. And if you don't know your spouse, listen, ignorance will guarantee that abuse is inevitable. So many of us are in abusive relationships because we're ignorant of the person that we're in the relationship with. And so just like when you buy something, it usually comes with a manual. It comes with a guide. And usually there are warranties and guarantees built into it. And it says, listen, if you read this manual, it will give you instructions on how effectively to use this particular product that you're purchasing. Well, you may say, well, when I got married, my wife didn't come with a manual. So I'm trying to figure this thing out. Well, the Bible is the manual. I heard someone said that Christians typically are biblically illiterate to everything in terms of the discussion of marriage. So from Genesis to Revelations, there's so much in the Word that speaks to relationship and union and marriage. But if we're ignorant of the Word and how a marriage should effectively function, and if we're ignorant of one another, then we're going to have a very problematic, toxic relationship. So it really starts with this connection here. Taking the time to learn them. So I have something called the Book of Danielle. It's a notebook. And everything I learn about her, I write in this book. The good and the bad. Oh, yes, there's a whole lot of bad. I need to know the bad because, listen, I need to know what not to do. I need to know what buttons not to push. I need to know how to approach so we have something that works.
What we use is something called our pillow talk activity. Now, this is interesting. When you're not married and you're single and dating and you're engaging when you shouldn't be, young folks never have a problem getting nude with each other. They'll get naked, they'll have sex, they'll do everything. They want it. But they're not married. It's not legal for them, right? But they don't become intimately vulnerable. They don't know much about each other. They don't share deep details because they're just not there yet. But then we get married and we start covering up when it's time to go to bed. We got the bonnet on. We got the muumuu on down to the floor. Like we don't make it, we become the opposite of what we were when we were dating. And so this pillow talk process that we go through is really a moment where we get nude, butt naked, in the bed, and we go through a list of questions. Because to Hasani's point, you know you change and become somebody new every 7 years? Do you know that biologically you're somebody new? And so if Hasani is operating based on the old Danielle and I'm operating based on the old Hasani, we're really going to be misaligned and unsatisfied in many areas. So we go through this pillow talk activity and answer these questions openly and honestly while we're nude. And that's how Hasani gets the answers to his book of Danielle, and that's how I get my answers for my book of Hasani. Because we need to stay on top of who our spouse is. We're constantly changing.
So what she's saying, gentlemen, or ladies actually, if you want to motivate your man to talk, get naked and have great conversation.
And he'll be very vulnerable. He'll be very vulnerable.
You better believe it. Does this make sense? Is this helping? Okay, so what we're going to do, because we've just run out of time, we're going to take a break. We're going to engage in some phenomenal breakfast food, and then we're going to come back for the Q&A portion of our session. And so once again, if you have questions regarding what we've spoken about, or if you have a question that has absolutely nothing to do with what was shared today, because you came here with a concern on your heart, write it down, because we can't address what we are not made aware of. So we want to turn this into a group counseling session so that we all get the therapy we need to go back home and have something more. Amen? Was this helpful?
Yeah, I was going to say, just make sure that you do write those questions down, and don't be afraid, because the questions that you asked, somebody else needed to hear too. A lot of times with the married couples, people are very shy and they want to cover go ahead and cover your paper if you're writing, but make sure you get these questions in so that we can help everybody in the room.
So our sister over here has a clear glass pot, and so during breakfast, write those questions down and make sure you give it to her so it gets in the pot. We want to have a chance to review it a little bit before we get started. All right, enjoy your breakfast, guys.